The Department of Motor Vehicles was busy that morning. People stood in long lines, holding papers and looking down at their phones. The room smelled like old chairs and coffee. The sound of printers and quiet talking filled the air. Behind the counters, workers moved slowly, helping one person at a time. In the middle of the line stood Mrs. Rivera. She was a quiet, middle-aged woman with warm brown eyes and a calm face. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a plain gray sweater. Her shoes were polished. She held her paperwork tightly and waited patiently. Mrs. Rivera had done this before. Renewing her driver's license was nothing new. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her calm presence often spoke for her. She didn't like crowds, but she didn't complain. A few spots ahead, people were showing their IDs to a man in uniform. He was standing tall with his chest out and a serious look on his face. His name badge read Officer Daniels. He was young and sharp-looking, with short blonde hair. He was helping out at the DMV as part of a local program for veterans. When Mrs. Rivera stepped forward, Officer Daniels gave her a quick glance. She handed him her paperwork and ID. He looked down at her ID and raised an eyebrow. "Where were you born?" he asked flatly. Mrs. Rivera looked up. "Texas," she said softly, her accent clear but her words easy to understand. Officer Daniels looked at her for a second too long, then under his breath, but loud enough for others nearby to hear, he muttered, "Why don't you just go back?" For a moment everything around them slowed. A woman behind Mrs. Rivera gasped slightly. A man 2 places back frowned and looked away. Mrs. Rivera didn't say anything. Her face stayed calm but her hands tightened slightly around her papers. She looked Officer Daniels in the eye. She didn't speak, she simply held out her paperwork again. Daniels, realizing others had heard him, looked away quickly and stamped the forms. "You're good," he said without looking at her. Mrs. Rivera took her papers and walked away. She didn't make a scene, she didn't show her feelings, but her heart beat a little faster. She stepped outside into the warm sunlight and closed her eyes for a second. The breeze brushed her face and for a moment she felt tired, not in her body but deep inside. Back inside the DMV, the line moved on. But the air still felt heavy. People looked at each other, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Rivera kept walking. She didn't look back, but something in her had been shaken loose. Something that had been quiet for a long, long time. Mrs. Rivera's house sat on a quiet street lined with old trees. The front porch had a small rocking chair and flower pots with bright red geraniums. Inside, the home was simple but full of warmth. Family pictures hung on the walls. A hand-stitched quilt lay across the couch. Later that evening, after the DMV visit, Mrs. Rivera sat alone at the kitchen table. The sun had gone down, and a soft lamp glowed beside her. Her papers from the DMV were still in her purse, untouched. She had tried not to think about what the officer said, but it stayed with her, echoing in her head. "Why don't you just go back?" She got up slowly and walked to the hallway. At the end was a wooden chest, old but cared for. She knelt beside it and opened the lid gently. Inside were photos, old letters, and folded pieces of fabric. Beneath them all was a small velvet box. She opened it carefully. Inside, shining even in the dim light, was a bronze star medal. Her hands rested on the edge of the box. Her eyes didn't blink. For a few moments, she said nothing. She had earned that medal many years ago. She had been a young soldier then, Private Elena Rivera, age 19. She had joined the U.S. Army because she wanted to serve her country. It was a hard decision. Some people told her it was dangerous. Others said she didn't belong in the military. But she didn't listen. She became a combat medic. She trained hard. She learned to stay calm under pressure. She saved lives. Her first tour was overseas, in a place full of dust and heat. She remembered the sounds of helicopters, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, and the weight of her pack. During one mission, her unit was ambushed. A young soldier was hit, bullets flew past them. But she didn't run. She dragged him behind cover and stopped the bleeding while enemy fire cracked in the distance. That day she kept going when others had frozen. Later they gave her the Bronze Star for bravery. She didn't ask for it. She didn't think she deserved it. She was just doing her job. After her service, she came home. She never told many people about the medal. She didn't brag, it stayed in that velvet box, in the chest, in the quiet corner of her hallway. Now holding the medal in her hands again, she whispered to herself, I never left, I always belonged here. Just then, the soft sound of footsteps came down the hall. Her granddaughter Sophia peeked in. Abuela, the girl said, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Are you okay? Mrs. Rivera smiled gently and closed the box. Yes, Mia, I'm okay. She stood, walked over, and kissed Sophia on the forehead. But deep inside, she wasn't okay. Not really. Not yet. Back at the DMV 2 days later, the morning was quiet. Officer Daniels sat at a small desk in the back room. He was organizing files, something he didn't enjoy but had to do as part of his volunteer hours. Most of the folders were boring, just paper copies of IDs, addresses, and license numbers. He moved quickly until he came across a folder with the name Elena M. Rivera. He paused. The name seemed familiar. He flipped open the file, expecting it to be like the others. But as he turned the first page, something caught his eye. It was a copy of a military ID. The photo showed a much younger Mrs. Rivera in uniform, her dark hair tucked under her cap. Her face looked the same, strong, focused, calm. Daniels blinked, confused. Why would someone like her have a military ID? He turned the page again. Next came a document with a gold star in the corner and typed words at the top. Citation for the Bronze Star Medal. He leaned closer. His eyes scanned the paper. It described a combat mission. How Specialist Rivera had saved a wounded soldier during enemy fire. How she had risked her life to carry him to safety. How she kept him alive with only the supplies in her pack. Daniels froze, his hands started to sweat. He swallowed hard. He turned one more page and found a photo, Mrs. Rivera in her army gear, standing tall, her uniform neat, a small smile on her lips. Her eyes were proud. The memory hit him like a slap. He had told her to go back. To go back when she had risked her life for the country he claimed to protect. He had judged her because of her accent. Her quiet voice, the color of her skin. He sat back in his chair, staring at the papers. Guilt crawled through his chest. It was heavy and cold. How could he have been so wrong? He remembered how she didn't say anything when he insulted her. How she didn't argue or even frown. She just looked at him like she had seen worse. And now he knew she had. All this time he thought he was helping serve his country by checking IDs and making comments under his breath. But he had disrespected a real hero. Someone who had done far more than he ever had. He stood up quickly, heart pounding. Angela, the older woman who worked at the next desk, looked over. Everything okay? She asked. Daniels nodded too fast. Yeah, I didn't know. He held up the folder slightly. Angela glanced at it. Rivera? Yeah, she served. Bronze Star, right? Daniels nodded again, slower this time. Angela looked at him carefully. You didn't know, did you? He shook his head. I judged her, I treated her like she didn't belong here. Angela sighed, that happens too often. People see someone's face or hear their voice and forget what really matters. But you saw her now. The real her. Daniels sat down, quieter this time. He looked back at the photo of young Elena Rivera in uniform. For the first time he realized something important. Being an officer wasn't about pride or control. It was about respect. It was about listening. And it was about knowing when you've made a mistake. And he had made a big one. Now he just had to figure out how to fix it. That evening, Officer Daniels didn't go straight home. Instead, he sat in his truck in the parking lot behind the DMV, staring out the window. The folder with Mrs. Rivera's name lay on the seat beside him. The words from her file kept echoing in his mind. Heroic actions under enemy fire. And his own words echoed too. Why don't you just go back? He dropped his head into his hands. He hadn't meant for it to go that far. At least that's what he told himself. But deep down he knew better. He had made a snap judgment, and it wasn't the first time. He'd been raised in a place where people whispered about others who looked different or spoke funny. He had thought serving in uniform made him better somehow. But now he knew Mrs. Rivera had worn that same uniform. And she had earned a medal for bravery. A real one. Not just paperwork and patches. The next day, Daniels walked into the DMV early. He found Angela already at her desk, sipping coffee and flipping through forms. "Angela," he said quietly. "Do you know where she lives?" "Mrs. Rivera." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I need to talk to her. I need to say something important." Angela studied him for a moment. Then she sighed and nodded. "She's in the system. I'll give you her address, but don't go there unless you're ready to listen more than talk." He nodded slowly. "I am." That afternoon, he drove to a quiet neighborhood not far from town. The houses were small but well kept. Children played in yards. Wind chimes clinked in the breeze. He pulled up to a little house with flower pots on the porch. His hands were sweaty again. He wiped them on his pants and walked to the door. For a second he almost turned around. But then he knocked. The door opened and there she was. Mrs. Rivera, dressed simply, calm as ever. She looked surprised, but not angry. Just quiet. "Yes?" she asked gently. Officer Daniels took off his cap. "Mrs. Rivera," he said, his voice unsteady. I'm the officer from the DMV. I said something wrong. Really wrong. I didn't know who you were. I judged you and I had no right to." She didn't speak. She just looked at him. "I saw your file," he continued. "I saw the medal. The Bronze Star. I saw what you did, and I'm sorry. I'm deeply sorry." Still, she didn't answer right away. She looked down, then back up. "I've heard words like that before," she said softly. "But they still hurt." Daniels nodded, ashamed. "I understand. Or, I'm trying to." Mrs. Rivera stepped onto the porch and stood a little closer. "You saw my medal," she said. "But I mattered even before you saw it." "I know," Daniels whispered. For a moment they just stood there. The wind blew gently through the trees. Then without a word, Daniels raised his hand and gave her a full proper salute. This time, with full respect. Not because of her medal, but because of who she was. Mrs. Rivera didn't return the salute. But she nodded once. And that was enough. The next day felt different. The sky was clear, and the air was cool. At her kitchen table, Mrs. Rivera stirred sugar into her coffee. Her thoughts quiet but restless. The visit from Officer Daniels the day before had left a weight on her chest, half pain, half relief. She wasn't sure what to think yet. She had heard many words in her life, kind ones, harsh ones, and ones like his, careless and cold. But she had also seen his face when he apologized. It wasn't fake. It was real. And sometimes, real was enough to begin again. Later that week, a letter came in the mail. Her granddaughter Sophia brought it in, waving the envelope. "Abuela, someone wrote to you." Mrs. Rivera took the envelope. It was handwritten, no stamp, just her name and address. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "Dear Mrs. Rivera, I wanted to say again how truly sorry I am. What I said was wrong, and there is no excuse. I judged you without knowing your story. I failed you and I failed everything I claim to stand for. You showed me what honor really looks like, not through anger, but through grace. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your strength. Officer Jake Daniels." She folded the letter and set it on the table. Sophia looked up at her. "Is it from that man?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Rivera said softly. "He's learning." That Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Rivera opened the door to find Officer Daniels standing there again. This time in full uniform. But something about him was different. His posture was more respectful, less proud. He held a small wooden box in both hands. "I asked the Veterans Hall if I could give this to you," he said. They agreed. He opened the box to reveal a plaque. It was simple with a bronze plate that read, "For service. For sacrifice. For silence that spoke louder than words. Thank you, Specialist Elena Rivera." Mrs. Rivera didn't speak right away. She traced the edge of the plaque with her fingers. People like me get forgotten, she said quietly. Until someone looks close. Daniels nodded. I didn't look. But I will now. Every time. He held out his hand. This time, Mrs. Rivera took it. You're young, she said. You still have time to be better. Daniels smiled a little. I will be. They stood there for a few more moments, strangers who had become something else. Not friends yet, but something closer to understanding. Before he left, Daniels saluted her again. And this time, Mrs. Rivera nodded and returned the salute. Not for him, but for what it could mean going forward. Inside, Sophia ran up and hugged her waist. Abuela, she said. You're kind of famous now. Mrs. Rivera smiled. Not famous, Mia. Just finally seen. A few weeks passed, and life returned to its quiet rhythm. Mrs. Rivera still woke early, made coffee, and cared for her small garden. But something inside her had shifted. For so long, she had stayed silent, not because she was weak, but because she didn't think anyone was listening. Now people were starting to listen. It began at Sophia's school. One of the teachers, Mrs. Lee, had heard about what happened. She invited Mrs. Rivera to speak to the class about her life. At first, Mrs. Rivera said no. She wasn't used to talking about herself. Especially not in front of children. But Sophia asked her gently one night. Please, Abuela. I want my friends to know how brave you are. So Mrs. Rivera said yes. On the day of the visit, she wore her simple gray sweater. She pinned her bronze star to the front, not for attention, but as a reminder of the story she was about to share. The classroom was bright and full of curious faces. Some of the children waved shyly. Others looked at the medal on her chest, with wide eyes. Mrs. Lee introduced her. This is Mrs. Rivera. She's a veteran of the U.S. Army. She's here to tell us about her service, and about respect. Mrs. Rivera cleared her throat. Her voice was soft but steady. I joined the Army when I was 19. She began. People didn't expect someone like me to wear a uniform. But I did. And I served proudly. She talked about what it meant to help others. About bravery, not the kind that came with noise and shouting, but the quiet kind that stayed strong, even when others tried to push you down. She didn't name Officer Daniels, but she spoke of moments when people said hurtful things. Sometimes people see your face or hear your voice, and they think they know your story. But they don't. That's why it's important to ask, to listen, and to learn. The room was completely still. One of the students raised a hand. Were you scared? Mrs. Rivera smiled gently. Yes. But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. It just means you care enough to try anyway. After the talk, the children clapped. Sophia hugged her tightly. I'm proud of you, she whispered. Later that day, Mrs. Rivera walked past the DMV again. She didn't need to go inside. She just stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. Through the glass, she saw Officer Daniels at his desk. He looked up, and this time he smiled and gave her a small nod of respect. She nodded back. Not everything had changed, but something had. She had found her voice again. And it was being heard. Quietly. Clearly. Finally. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength of those around you. Like, comment, and subscribe to support more stories that shine a light on respect, understanding, and the unseen heroes among us. Your voice can help amplify theirs.